Welcome to Restful Tales, your doorway to peaceful dreams. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to keep the stories alive. Sweet dreams await. Let's begin the story. The road to Glomshore was narrow and winding, bordered by jagged cliffs on one side and an endless expanse of gray sea on the other. Caleb's car struggled up the uneven path, the engine humming a monotonous tune, as if in tune with the desolate landscape. The fog hung heavy, a thick curtain that dulled the sun and swallowed the horizon. Caleb glanced at the map on the passenger seat, though it was unnecessary now. He had memorized the route weeks ago, studying every twist and turn, every stretch of emptiness leading to the village. He wasn't running toward anything, just away from the city, away from the noise, away from the blank canvas of his life. As he reached the crest of the hill, the first glimpse of Glomshore came into view. The village lay like a forgotten relic, perched precariously on the edge of the world. Its small, weathered houses seemed to lean into each other for support, their wooden frames battered by years of relentless wind and salt. Beyond them, the sea stretched endlessly, a slate-gray void that matched the sky. Caleb parked near the village's edge and stepped out into the cool, damp air. The scent of brine was overpowering, mingling with the faint, earthy aroma of moss and wet wood. The fog wrapped around him like an old, familiar blanket, softening the edges of everything. The villagers moved slowly, their figures emerging and disappearing into the mist like ghosts. A few of them turned to glance at him, their expressions unreadable, their eyes lingering a moment too long before they moved on. Caleb felt their curiosity, but also something else, wary, muted, like the place itself. The small inn where he would stay for the foreseeable future was exactly as the online listing had promised. Rustic and unassuming. A wooden sign above the door creaked in the wind. The words "Seafarer's Rest," barely visible beneath years of peeling paint. Inside, the air was warm but carried a faint smell of mildew. The innkeeper, a wiry woman named Agnes, greeted him with a polite but distant nod. "You're the artist, eh?" she said, her voice gravelly as though it hadn't been used much lately. Caleb nodded, setting his bag on the counter. "Just looking for some peace and quiet." Agnes snorted softly, handing him a rusted key. "Well, you'll find that here. Maybe more than you bargained for." Her words lingered as Caleb climbed the narrow staircase to his room. It was small but tidy, with a single window overlooking the village square. From here, he could see the fog creeping through the alleys like a living thing. The sea was invisible, hidden behind the shroud of mist, but he could hear it, a low, constant roar that filled the air like background music. That night, Caleb ventured out, restless after hours of unpacking and aimless sketching. The village streets were deserted, the lamplight dim and smothered by the fog. He wandered toward the shoreline, drawn by the sound of waves crashing against the rocks. The beach was a stretch of dark, coarse sand, littered with driftwood and seaweed. Caleb stood at the edge, staring into the gray void where the sea met the sky. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a faint, flickering light far out in the distance. It danced like a will-o'-the-wisp, its glow warm and golden against the cold gray backdrop. Caleb squinted, unsure if he was imagining it. The light swayed gently, almost invitingly, before fading into the fog. A shiver ran down his spine, but it wasn't fear. It was something else. A pull, faint but undeniable, that seemed to whisper his name. He stayed there for a long time, staring at the spot where the light had been, until the tide began to creep closer and the chill in the air drove him back to the inn. That night, as he lay in bed, the sound of the waves lulled him to sleep, but his dreams were restless, filled with faint whispers and the flicker of golden light. The morning broke quietly, the fog clinging stubbornly to the village like a second skin. Caleb awoke with a start, the strange whispers from his dreams still echoing faintly in his ears. He shook them off as remnants of a restless night and made his way downstairs to the inn's small dining room. Agnes was there, fussing over a pot of coffee. She glanced up as he entered, her sharp eyes studying him for a moment. "Sleep well?" she asked, her tone neutral but not entirely unfriendly. "Not bad," Caleb lied. He poured himself a cup of coffee and took a seat by the window. Outside, the square was eerily still, the fog turning everything into faint, ghostly outlines. Agnes sat down across from him, cradling her own mug. "You went out last night," she said, more a statement than a question. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "How'd you know?" "Word gets around in a place like this. Besides, I saw your tracks down by the shore this morning." He chuckled softly. "Guess I'll have to get used to living in a fishbowl." Agnes didn't laugh. Instead, she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Did you see it?" "See what?" Caleb asked, though he already knew what she meant. Agnes's expression hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "The lantern," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see the light?" For a moment, Caleb considered denying it, but something in her tone, the quiet intensity, the unspoken fear, made him nod. "I think so, out in the distance near the water. It wasn't much, just a faint glow." Agnes sighed, shaking her head. "I hoped you wouldn't." She sat back, staring into her coffee as though it held answers. "It's an old thing, that lantern. Nobody knows where it came from or why. Some say it's just a trick of the fog, light bouncing off the water. But most of us, we know better." Caleb frowned. "Know better how?" Agnes hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "The light shows up on stormy nights, always out near the sea. Folks who see it say it calls to them, whispers things only they can hear. And if they follow it..." She trailed off, her eyes distant. "They disappear?" Caleb guessed. Agnes nodded grimly. "Some never come back. Others, well, they come back, but they're not the same. Something changes them, like the light took a piece of them with it." Caleb leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "And you believe this?" "The whole village does. I believe enough to stay clear of it," Agnes said sharply. "You should too." He wanted to ask more, but the sound of footsteps interrupted them. A fisherman entered, nodding a curt greeting before helping himself to coffee. Agnes gave Caleb a warning look, as if to say, "Not another word," and rose to tend to her guest. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. Caleb spent the morning wandering the village, sketching the weathered houses and narrow alleys. The fog lifted slightly around midday, revealing more of the coastline, a jagged line of rocks and cliffs that seemed to stretch endlessly. He spoke briefly with a few of the villagers, though their conversations were polite but guarded. It was clear they didn't fully trust him yet. When he asked about the lantern, most of them deflected or changed the subject. Only one old woman, knitting on her porch, offered him anything close to an answer. "It's the sea's way of calling you home," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "The lantern knows your heart, knows what you've lost. That's how it gets you." "What do you mean?" Caleb asked, but she only shook her head and returned to her knitting, as if she had said too much already. That night, as the fog thickened and the waves began to crash louder against the rocks, Caleb found himself staring out his window. He thought of the lantern, its faint glow in the distance, and the whispers he had heard in his dream. What did Agnes mean when she said it took a piece of people? And why did the old woman think it knew his heart? As the storm rolled in, Caleb felt the same pull he had the night before. The sound of the wind howling through the village seemed almost like a voice, urging him toward the shore. He fought the urge, forcing himself to stay inside, but sleep came fitfully, haunted by images of the lantern's golden light. Somewhere in the darkness, the whispers returned. The wind howled through the narrow alleyways of Glomshore that night, tugging at the shutters of the weather-worn houses and shaking the old sign outside Seafarer's Rest. Caleb lay awake, his mind restless and swirling with half-formed thoughts. The whispers came again, soft and distant, threading through his mind like a song in the wind. His pulse quickened. Were they dreams, or had he heard them before, just beyond the veil of sleep? He tried to shake it off, focusing on the rhythmic sound of the waves and the groaning of the fog outside his window. Then, a faint glimmer caught his eye, came from the shore. Caleb froze, his breath catching in his chest. He leaned against the window pane, trying to steady his hands. Through the mist, there it was, a pale, flickering glow, soft and golden. It swayed gently, pulsing as though alive. It wasn't his imagination. His heart thundered as he stared. The glow seemed to dance, almost playful, just at the edge of the water. He could feel it, the same pull from before, a soft tug at the back of his mind. His hands clenched the windowsill. "Don't," he whispered to himself, but he could feel his body moving before he had a chance to stop it. His legs were cold as he stood, his breath shallow. His shoes scraped the wooden floor as he grabbed his coat and stepped outside. The fog was colder now. It wrapped itself around him like icy fingers as he made his way toward the beach. The glow swayed again, this time closer. Caleb could feel his own heartbeat as he approached, each beat louder. He fought his nerves but couldn't stop his feet. The sand underfoot was cold and wet, the air alive with mist and sea. And then nothing. The glow was gone. Caleb stopped, his breath coming fast. His hands trembled. He looked out at the endless fog and felt nothing but silence. Had it been real, or had his mind played tricks on him? His pulse slowed, but he still couldn't shake the feeling. His fingers trembled as he looked down at his hands, felt as though he could still feel the light. The whispers returned. Caleb awoke the next morning with a dull headache and the taste of salt lingering on his tongue. He didn't sleep well. His dreams tangled with the golden glow and the whispers that clung to him like a shroud. After gathering his coat and sketch pad, he decided to visit the lighthouse just beyond the village's edge. The lighthouse stood atop a steep cliff, its silhouette stark against the gray sky. A tall, solitary figure was visible at the top, tending to the light. The path to the lighthouse was uneven, a mix of wet rocks and twisting earth. The wind howled through the trees as he climbed the hill. Caleb's breath came in short, sharp bursts as he finally reached the base of the lighthouse, its walls battered by wind and sea spray. The sound of footsteps came from behind the weathered door. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a thin, elderly man with sharp features and wind-burned skin. His hair was white, and his eyes were piercing, as though he could see right through Caleb. "You must be the artist," the man said, his voice low and calm. "You've come looking." Caleb hesitated, caught off guard. "Looking? I'm not sure what you mean." The man's gaze sharpened. "They all come looking. The lantern always calls." Before Caleb could reply, the man gestured to the lighthouse behind him. "Come inside." The inside of the lighthouse was cold, its walls damp with sea mist. The elderly man closed the door behind them, the sound of it locking sending a shiver through Caleb. The room was stark and small, with a table, a chair, and a spiral staircase that led upward to the light itself. The man gestured to a worn wooden chair by the table. "Sit," he said. Caleb obeyed, unsure why he felt so compelled to do so. The man didn't waste time with pleasantries. His voice was steady as he began. "The lantern has a way of finding you, Caleb. The senses a need, a desire." Caleb frowned. "How do you know my name?" The man smiled faintly, his gaze distant. "Because I know what it does. I know how it calls." Caleb's throat felt dry. "What are you talking about?" The man took a deep breath. His voice was steady but unyielding. "The lantern isn't just a light. It's more than that. It shows you what you want to see, but it takes a piece of you in return. Every soul it takes never returns the same." Caleb stared, unsure whether to believe him. His voice came out hoarse. "And you're telling me this because?" The man's eyes narrowed. "Because you've already seen it, haven't you?" Caleb's mouth opened, but no words came. His hands tightened on his sketchpad. The man leaned in closer. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Stay away from it. The fog always lingers for those who listen too closely." With that, he turned toward the spiral staircase, leaving Caleb sitting at the table. Caleb stayed for a few moments, uncertain. The wind howled outside, and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks seemed to press into his chest. He left without another word. Caleb wandered back into the heart of Glomshore, the wind tugging at his coat as he tried to shake off the strange encounter with the lighthouse keeper. The man's words lingered in his mind, curling like smoke at the edges of his thoughts. "The lantern isn't just a light. It shows you what you want to see, but it takes a piece of you in return." He tried to make sense of it, but the fog and the waves seemed to press on his thoughts, refusing clarity. The village felt quieter now, the air still damp and heavy with mist. He made his way back towards Seafarer's Rest, but his mind kept drifting back to the lighthouse and its keeper. Something about the man felt both menacing and familiar, as though his words weren't the first time Caleb had heard them. His sketchpad was clutched tightly in his hand. He looked down at his latest drawing, a rough pencil sketch of the fog and the cliffs. His hand trembled as he added detail to the shadowy shapes. Then he froze, One of the figures he had drawn looked like the golden glow he'd seen the night before. Caleb stared at it for a moment, the pencil still in his hand. His heart began to pound again. It wasn't much, a smudge of lines and shadows, but something about it felt real, felt alive. He closed his sketchbook abruptly, as though it would chase away the creeping unease. Later that afternoon, Caleb returned to the small cafe near the square to gather his thoughts. The cafe smelled of freshly baked bread and coffee, warm and inviting. He sat at a table by the window and tried to focus on his sketch, but his hand was shaking. The fog had returned, even thicker than before. He could barely make out the outlines of the houses across the square. The townsfolk bustled through the mist, their faces obscured by scarves and coats. Caleb could feel their eyes glancing at him, a sort of suspicion always lingering. He took a sip of coffee, trying to clear his mind, when his phone buzzed. It was a message from his brother back home, checking in, asking how things were going. Caleb stared at the words, then set his phone down. His fingers went back to his sketch pad, but the unease lingered. His hand was trembling too much to draw. He knew there was something wrong here, something buried beneath the fog, beneath the whispers, beneath the light. He closed the sketch pad again and stared at the swirling mist. It wasn't just memories or stress. It felt real. Somewhere in the village, something was watching. The fog remained dense the next morning, the kind that clung to the skin and sank into bones. Caleb found himself unable to resist the pull of exploration. Curiosity gnawed at him, a whisper of unease that wouldn't let him stay put. He set out on foot, the mist wrapping around him like cold fingers as he made his way toward the outskirts of the village. The air was heavy and damp, the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs his only companion. His boots crunched against wet earth as he found himself standing at the edge of an old, overgrown path. The path was barely visible, swallowed by tufts of grass and tangled roots. Caleb could feel its history, its weight, its years of neglect. The locals had likely avoided this path for ages, but something about it called to him. His hand hesitated over his sketch pad, but then he stuffed it into his coat pocket and took a step forward. The air felt colder here, colder than the village square, colder than the sea breeze. The mist thickened as he ventured further, so dense now that the outlines of trees loomed like dark sentinels on either side of the path. His breath came in short puffs, his heart beating louder with each step. The fog was alive, twisting and shifting in unpredictable ways. Shapes moved just at the edges of his vision, half-glimpsed figures that darted into the shadows. Caleb tried to tell himself it was merely the wind or his own nerves, but doubt lingered. The path wound through thick woods, roots tangling and stone walls appearing where they shouldn't have. Caleb's sense of time felt skewed. Was he walking for minutes or hours? His hands trembled against his coat as his boots slipped on damp moss. The sound of the waves became quieter the further he moved. And then he saw it, a rusted iron gate, half buried in ivy and wet vines. Its hinges groaned as he approached, and when Caleb pushed it open, it revealed a narrow path leading towards something in the mist. A house. The house was ancient, its frame leaning with age, shutters broken and weather-worn. The windows were dusty, and as Caleb stood there, staring at the dark outline of the building, he felt his pulse quicken again. Was this abandoned? Or had someone lived here not long ago? He took a step closer, his breathing shallow. The mist crept toward the house, swallowing it further. He could feel his body resisting, his mind warning him to leave, but his feet refused to obey. He had to know. Caleb climbed the steps, the wood beneath his boots groaning, damp and brittle. His hand lingered on the doorknob, a brass relic, tarnished and cold, and he hesitated. His mind was spinning. What if this was the lantern's call? What if this was the pull that Agnes and the lighthouse keeper had warned him about? Before he could stop himself, his hand turned the knob. The door opened with a sharp creak. The interior was darker than expected. Shadows falling across wooden floors and antique furniture. The air smelled of mildew and dust, the kind of emptiness that had long forgotten the touch of sunlight. Caleb hesitated in the doorway, his breathing quick. And then footsteps. They came from somewhere deeper in the house. Caleb froze, his heart pounding so hard it felt as if it would burst. His hand closed around his coat tightly. The footsteps were soft, deliberate, as if someone else were here with him. But no one lived here. "Hello," Caleb tried, his voice weak and uncertain. His words were swallowed by the fog and shadows. The sound came again, closer this time. Caleb could almost feel the presence, a vague shape just at the edge of the dark. His body refused to move. His throat felt dry. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. The house was silent. Caleb took a careful breath, steadying himself. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to turn back, return to the village. But his curiosity held him steady. His hand went to his sketchpad again, and he glanced at the faint outlines of pencil marks from earlier. Something about this house felt connected to that golden light. Something that made him uneasy and yet compelled him to stay. He stepped inside. The air inside the house was colder, the dampness seeping into his bones as Caleb stepped across the wooden threshold. His breath fogged in front of him, and every sound felt amplified. The groaning of the floorboards, the whisper of wind against broken windows. The shadows danced on the walls as if mocking him. He hesitated, his hand clutching the sketchpad tighter. The house had a stillness about it, almost as though it were alive. The faintest creaks came from somewhere above, and his pulse quickened. He took a step further into the dark hall. The entryway opened into a small living room. Dust-covered furniture sat beneath cobwebs that hung like curtains in the dim light. Caleb could make out a large stone hearth and a set of faded curtains, but nothing seemed alive. His footsteps felt intrusive, out of place, as though his presence in this forgotten house was an intrusion on a sleeping spirit. And then he saw it. At the end of the hall was a door, dark wood, cracked but sturdy. It called to him, its shape ominous in the half-light. His hand trembled as he approached and turned the knob. The door gave a low groan as it swung open. He stepped into a dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves, all stacked with old books and what appeared to be trinkets. Familiar relics, though their purpose escaped him. But it was the far wall that caught his attention. A single, large portrait hung there, its gold leaf frame dulled by dust and time. The figure in the portrait stared at him with hollow eyes, features sharp and pale, the kind of face that seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. Caleb froze, The figure in the portrait bore an unmistakable resemblance to the golden glow from the shore, the same ethereal shape that had haunted his dreams and pulled at his mind. His hand rose instinctively, reaching toward the sketchpad. He could feel the pull again. "Don't!" he muttered under his breath, his voice shaking, but he couldn't resist the urge. His hand clutched his pencil and he began to draw. The pencil moved quickly, lines sketched in haste, mirroring the figure's face, its shadowy glow. His hand was steady despite the unease, and yet each line felt as if it belonged to another, not to him. The figure's eyes stared back at him as he sketched, and the sensation was overwhelming, like his hand wasn't entirely his own. The moment he stopped, he felt his chest tighten. He looked at the completed sketch. The face was familiar, far too familiar. Caleb felt his legs tremble beneath him. His breath came in quick gasps. He could almost hear whispers again, the faint sound of breathing so soft it could have been his own. Before he could process his thoughts, the sound came again. It was louder this time, footsteps soft and deliberate. Caleb spun around, his heart slamming into his ribs. But there was no one there. His chest heaved and he looked back at the sketch. It seemed to shimmer, faintly, as though it were alive, shifting in the half-light of the room. The pull was stronger now. He backed toward the door, his hands shaking as he tried to steady himself. The whispers came louder this time, rising and falling with his breath. "You know the way. You know what it wants." Caleb couldn't shake the feeling. His legs trembled as he turned back toward the hall, clutching the sketchpad like a weapon. The figure in the portrait lingered in his mind, its hollow gaze haunting him. He closed the door behind him, his breath coming fast. Whatever this was, it wasn't finished. Caleb's hands trembled as he clutched his sketchpad to his chest. His breath came in sharp, shallow bursts as he stumbled back through the dim hallway. The whispers felt louder now, closer, more insistent. Every step he took seemed heavier, as though the air itself were pulling him back toward the portrait. He forced himself through the living room, his feet scraping against the wooden floor. His thoughts were a whirlwind, sketching the figure, the golden glow, the sensation of being pulled, the footsteps. His mind felt fragile, a thousand threads unraveling. When he finally emerged into the misty light outside the front door, it felt as though a pressure had lifted, though he could still feel the presence behind him. His hand clenched the sketchpad tighter. The air was colder now. The wind tugged at his coat, and the fog had grown thicker. He glanced back at the house one last time, its silhouette shrouded in mist. The windows stared back at him like black eyes, unblinking. Caleb tried to shake off his unease as he began walking toward the village. His steps were slow, deliberate, his breath uneven. He could feel the weight of what he had seen and sketched, the image of that golden face lingering behind his closed eyelids. His legs felt weak, but he pressed on. His mind kept returning to the lighthouse keeper's words. The fog always lingers for those who listen too closely. What did it mean? What was listening too closely? The path back to the village was winding, damp earth and wet leaves underfoot. The fog closed in on all sides. His thoughts were so loud, his fears so strong, that he hardly noticed when the sound of footsteps joined him again. They were light, almost imperceptible, but steady. Caleb paused. He turned his head sharply, his heart pounding. The fog swallowed everything. His breath caught. His voice trembled as he called into the air. "Who's there?" Silence. And then the sound came again. His stomach sank. It wasn't a sound he could explain. It wasn't the wind, nor was it a trick of his imagination. His breath came fast as he forced himself forward, each step harder than the last. He broke through the fog and back into the village square, his hands shaking as he hurried toward Seafarer's Rest. His heart thudded as though it would escape his chest. He didn't stop walking until he was back in the cafe, sitting at a small table with his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The whispers faded, but Caleb could still feel them. He stared at his hands at the sketchpad. His hand felt warm against the cold ceramic of the cup. His breaths came steady, but the lingering tension clung to him. He set his sketchpad down on the table and forced himself to focus on the coffee. His hands were still shaking, and he could feel his heartbeat in his chest, steady and cold. The fog was watching. Caleb knew it. The days following his strange journey through the fog felt heavier, as though the weight of his unease had anchored itself to Caleb's bones. Sleep came in short bursts, fragmented by dreams of golden light, whispers, and shadowy figures watching him. It was as if the fog had embedded itself in his very thoughts. Caleb knew he needed clarity. His mind kept pulling him back to that old house, the one with the portrait and the cold air, and the sensation he'd felt there. But there was no way he could return without some kind of lead. That's when he remembered something his grandmother had once told him. The local archives. There was a small building at the heart of the village. A cramped, dusty archive of old records, letters, and journals. Many of them belonged to seafaring families, recounting old tales, shipwrecks, and strange disappearances from long ago. Caleb had dismissed it on his first visit to Glomshore, but now he felt certain it would hold the key to what had been happening to him. That morning, he left Seafarer's Rest behind and made his way through the mist toward the archive. His breath came steadily as he climbed the narrow path that led to the ancient stone building. It was a modest structure with old wooden beams and ivy growing at its edges. The door looked as though it hadn't been used in a century. Caleb hesitated before knocking. The sound of footsteps met him from within, and the door creaked open before he could lift his hand. A thin, middle-aged woman stood on the other side. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her gray coat looked as if it belonged to another era entirely. "You're new to the archives," she said in a calm, even voice. Her gaze fell on him. "You must be the artist." Caleb's throat tightened. "Yes, I'm looking for old records, letters, journals, anything about the lighthouse, the fog, strange disappearances." The woman stepped aside, gesturing into the musty, dim-lit interior of the building. "Come in. I think we might have something for you." The archives were cold and musty, the air faintly damp and tinged with the smell of old paper and wood. The woman led Caleb through a narrow hallway lined with shelves. The sound of creaking wood and dust accompanied their steps as they moved deeper into the building. Each letter and journal was carefully labeled, organized by date and name, but the atmosphere was oppressive. Narrow aisles and forgotten stories wrapped around Caleb like a shroud. The woman gestured to a table in the center of the room. "You'll find what you need here." Caleb set down his sketch pad and began searching. The woman pulled out a dusty folder and handed it to him without a word. The folder felt ancient in his hands, worn and fragile. Caleb opened it hesitantly. The first letter was dated nearly 100 years ago. It detailed a shipwreck, a fog-draped journey through dangerous waters, and the strange light that appeared on the horizon as their ship sank. The words were jagged, the handwriting struggling against the confines of the page. The author spoke of visions, golden lights that would appear from the sea, and figures glimpsed in the waves. Caleb's breath quickened as he read. He turned the page, reading another account. This one spoke of a man in the village, a lighthouse keeper, who had gone mad after seeing the glow in the fog. His description matched the warnings he'd received from the keeper himself. The more Caleb read, the more the words resonated with his experience. The whispers, the visions, the golden glow, the pull of the lantern light. His hand clutched at the page as though it could shield him from the truth. "Fog doesn't just hide," the woman said, appearing beside him. "It remembers." Caleb turned to look at her, startled. "What do you mean?" His voice felt weak. She gestured toward the stack of letters. "Many people have felt the pull of the light. Over time, they forget or they die. But the fog remains, Caleb. It remembers." He looked back at the letter, his breath uneven. The stories spoke of disappearances, drownings, and madness. Each name, each date, felt like another thread in a web he couldn't escape. "There's always a cost," she added softly, as though reading his mind. "For every desire, for every need you chase, the fog collects, the lantern takes." Caleb stared at her, his hands shaking. His fingers gripped the letter, the words blurring before him. The golden glow, the whispers, the portrait. Was he truly alone, or had he already been ensnared? Before he could ask her more, she stepped back toward the shelves. "You'll find the answers in the stories. Just be careful what you seek." With that, she was gone, leaving Caleb alone with the musty air, the damp stone walls, and the smell of old paper. His hands clutched at the letter, his mind racing. The words repeated themselves. "The fog remembers," and Caleb began to fear that it remembered him. Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that the fog was alive. It lingered in the air around him, even as he returned to Seafarer's Rest. His hands clutched the old letter from the archives as if it might protect him from the encroaching pull. But it wasn't just fog anymore. It felt like something else. A whisper, an invitation, a force. That evening, Caleb found himself sitting by the small fire in his rented room, staring into the orange glow as though it would reveal the answers he sought. His body ached with exhaustion, but sleep was elusive. The whispers from that cold house lingered, returning with every creak of the wooden beams overhead, every hiss of the wind against the narrow windows. He couldn't push the sensation away. The golden glow, the pull, the whispers, the footsteps. Something was coming. His sketch pad lay on the table beside him, and his hand hovered over it. He tried to resist, but his fingers moved on their own, the pencil gliding across the paper, sketching faint outlines. His hand grew more confident with every stroke. His mind felt detached, as if he were merely watching himself sketch. The drawing came into focus. It was the face again, the golden figure, its eyes dark yet knowing, its expression distant yet familiar. His breath hitched as he gazed at it. His hand had drawn it without his permission, without his thought. He stared at the image as though it might speak to him, and then, without warning, he felt it. The pull came from the window. Caleb froze, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. He set the pencil down, his hand trembling, and looked toward the window. The mist had come in again, heavier this time. It was alive, a shifting curtain of gray that danced and swayed. And then, just at the edge of his vision, he saw it. A golden glow. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Caleb's chest tightened. He stood, gripping the table, staring into the mist as it grew stronger, brighter. His heart felt as though it might split in his chest. His breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. It was the same glow. It was closer now. His body acted before his mind could catch up. He pulled on his coat, snatched his sketch pad from the table, and ran toward the door. His heart felt like it would give out with each step, but he couldn't stop. His hands gripped the wood of the door as he flung it open into the cold, damp air. The mist wrapped around him. Caleb moved toward the shore, his breath fogging. His body moved on its own, compelled, his feet sinking into the wet sand as he followed the glow. It was there, faint but distinct, the same golden light he had seen in his dreams and in the cold house. His sketch pad flapped against his chest as he ran. He could hear whispers again, low and familiar. His heartbeat roared in his ears. His legs trembled as he fought to maintain his balance against the wind and sand. And then he saw it, a figure. It stood on the shore, half-formed in the fog. The golden glow pulsed softly, casting eerie shadows against the sand. Caleb could barely see its features, but he knew it was watching him. "Wait," he called out, his voice trembling. "Please wait." His words disappeared into the mist, but the figure didn't stop. It was moving, shifting, as though beckoning him. His feet felt heavy as he trudged closer. His breaths came faster and faster. His body ached. It was drawing him in. He stumbled. The fog thickened around him, and the whispers became louder. His sketchpad trembled as if alive. He could hear his own breath, feel the weight of his footsteps, feel himself slipping into the pull of the glow. And then he reached the spot where the glow was strongest. The air was colder here, colder than anything he had ever felt. His hands trembled as he clutched his sketchpad to his chest. He could feel its warmth against his fingers. Something touched his shoulder. He froze. The golden glow was bright now, searing, piercing, and he could hear voices. A chorus, all at once, overlapping, indecipherable. His breath came in gasps. His knees shook, and he could feel the presence behind him, the pull of the figure. It whispered, "You are closer now." Caleb tried to step back, but his body refused. His muscles felt weak. His vision swam. His hands clenched the sketchpad tighter. "I don't know what you want from me," he whispered. His voice felt hollow. The whisper came again, closer this time. "You know," Caleb gasped. The words felt cold against his skin. His breath hitched as he felt the pull again. The golden glow washing over him, pushing him toward it. The whispers, the pull, the figure, it was all here, all at once, all too close. He could feel the fog, the cold, and the golden glow wrapping around him like an ancient thread. And then, a sudden, sharp sound broke the moment. A voice, distant, footsteps. Caleb's legs shook as he struggled to turn. His hand grasped at his coat. His vision cleared as he turned toward the sound. His pulse thundered in his chest. Someone else was here. The glow faltered, dimming. Caleb gasped, his knees collapsing beneath him. His body felt as though it could no longer stand. His breaths came in ragged bursts as he looked toward the sound. The figure, the golden glow, had disappeared. The fog was pulling away. Caleb collapsed to the sand. He could still hear the whispers, but they were fading now. Caleb awoke to the sound of seagulls. His head throbbed, and his hands felt numb as he tried to push himself up from the cold sand. His breaths came in shallow, shaky bursts. The fog had lifted, the horizon a pale gray-blue under the morning sky. It felt distant now, as though the events of the previous night were merely a bad dream. But they weren't. His fingers brushed against the sketch pad, still damp and clinging to his coat. He held it close to his chest as if it could shield him from the memories of golden glows and whispers. His body ached. His chest felt hollow, as though the pull from the night before had left him drained. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself, but his voice trembled. He forced himself up, his feet shaky, and began walking toward the lighthouse on the cliff. It was an imposing figure in the pale light, its dark silhouette sharp against the sky. Caleb remembered the keeper from his first visit to Glomshore, the way the old man had watched him with weary, knowing eyes. If anyone could make sense of what was happening to him, it was the lighthouse keeper. The climb up the narrow path toward the lighthouse was exhausting. His legs felt heavier with every step, his breath short and uneven. The wind tugged at his coat, and the sound of the waves below rose and fell like distant whispers. The path was steep, the stone uneven. When Caleb finally stood at the door of the lighthouse, he knocked hard, his hand aching from the effort. The door creaked open. The lighthouse keeper stood in the doorway. He was an older man, his hair gray, his eyes sharp and steady. His coat flapped against his thin frame in the wind. His gaze was piercing as he took Caleb in. "You've come back," the keeper said, his voice low and calm. His expression was unreadable. I wondered how long it would take. Caleb's throat felt dry. He tried to speak, but his voice caught. His words came out in a hushed, shaky rush. "I saw it," he managed. His voice broke. "I saw the glow, pulled me. I can't get it out of my head." The keeper regarded him for a moment, his face unreadable. Then he stepped back from the door, gesturing inside. "Come in," he said. The interior of the lighthouse was small and dim, the air colder than Caleb expected. The walls were lined with maps, journals, and logs. The sound of the wind whistling through cracks in the walls felt like distant voices. The keeper gestured toward a table by the fire. "Sit," he said. Caleb obeyed, his hands trembling as he set the sketchpad down. The keeper studied the fire for a moment before turning his sharp gaze back to Caleb. "I warned you before," the keeper said, "but you didn't listen." "You listened." Caleb swallowed hard. "What does that mean?" The keeper's gaze sharpened further. "The fog remembers. It always remembers. And when you listen too closely, It begins to listen back. Caleb stared at him. His heart felt as though it would burst from his chest. "What am I supposed to do?" His voice was desperate. The keeper's brow furrowed as he looked at the flickering flames. "You can't escape it, but you can try to understand it." He looked at Caleb, his gaze intense. "The golden light has been here for a long time. People disappear in the fog. They drown. They are taken. But they listen too in their own way. It draws you in because you hear its whispers, because it knows your fears." Caleb felt his body slump. "I don't know how to stop this," he whispered. His voice cracked. "I don't know how to escape it." The keeper's expression softened just a little. "You can't escape it by running," he said. His words were quiet, but they carried weight. "You face it. You learn. You fight." Caleb looked down at his hands, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. His heart felt leaden. "But how?" he whispered. His voice felt small. "How can I fight it?" The keeper hesitated. His voice was careful, deliberate. "You'll need knowledge," he said finally. "The fog is ancient. It feeds on stories, on secrets, on history. Find the old accounts. Learn the names. Learn the dates." He paused, glancing back toward the sea through the small window. The horizon was gray and misty, the waves tumbling in the distance. "And listen to this," he added, turning back toward Caleb. His voice grew sharp again. "The fog isn't just memory, it's hunger." Caleb felt cold at the words. His breath came in sharp bursts. "What happens if I can't stop it?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. The keeper stared at him, his eyes hard. "Then you become part of its story." Caleb froze. The fire crackled between them, the sound deep and heavy in the still room. The keeper didn't speak again, but his words lingered in Caleb's chest like an anchor. His heart felt heavy. His breath came uneven. It wasn't just about running anymore. It was about learning, about fighting, about surviving. And Caleb had no idea how to do any of it. Caleb couldn't shake the lighthouse keeper's words as he left the old man's small, dimly lit home. The wind tugged at his coat as he made his way back down the cliff path toward Seafarer's Rest. He felt the weight of the keeper's warning like a stone in his pocket. The fog isn't just memory. This hunger. He had no idea what that meant, but it gnawed at him, biting and persistent. He could feel its presence again. The golden glow, the pull of whispers, the strange tug that had led him to the shore last night. There was no escaping it, not with running, not with avoidance. He needed knowledge. He needed to dig. Back at Seafarer's Rest, Caleb decided the best way forward was to uncover every story, every journal, every mystery that had to do with the fog, the golden light, and Glomshore itself. His first stop would be the old archives again. The woman who had greeted him the day before would have more answers, he hoped. His sketchpad felt heavier now, as if the figures within its pages were alive, waiting for him to solve their mystery. The archives again. Caleb returned to the archives just after noon. The air was still misty, though the clouds seemed less oppressive. The woman who had opened the door for him before was waiting in her dim, narrow office. The smell of ink and aged paper lingered in the air. Her sharp, gray eyes met his as he entered. "You're persistent," she said, setting down a glass of tea. Caleb hesitated, unsure how to explain himself. I need to find out about the fog, he said. His voice was low, uncertain. The golden glow, the disappearances. Her gaze didn't waver. She set her glass down and gestured toward the shelves again. The fog has many stories, she said simply, standing. Her voice was sharp and deliberate, as though each word were carefully chosen. The archives hold only pieces of the puzzle. You want answers, you'll need to listen. Caleb clenched his hands into fists, his breath shallow. I'll listen, he said. She pulled open a drawer from a nearby cabinet, rifling through papers and journals with practiced precision. The stories are always here, she said, pulling out an old leather-bound journal. She set it on the table between them. You may find what you're looking for here. Caleb hesitated. His hands trembled as he reached for the journal. He could feel the weight of its leather cover, its dust, its age. It was cold beneath his fingers. What is this? He asked, looking at her. It's a journal from the early 1800s, she said. A lighthouse keeper's personal record. Many stories are buried here. Caleb lifted it, turning it in his hands. His heart pounded. He opened the book to the first page and began to read. The journal's revelations. The pages were rough, handwritten in a looping, elegant script that spoke of daily life on the cliffs and the slow rhythm of tides. The earliest entries were mundane. Notes about weather, shipwrecks, tides, and fishing. But as Caleb's eyes scanned the entries, they grew darker. One passage caught his attention. February 7th, 1823. The fog came again. It always comes, like waves, rolling in from the sea. This time, however, I saw the glow, the golden glow. The lighthouse does its work, yet the glow persists. I believe there are souls in the mist, watching, whispering. Caleb's heart slammed into his ribs. He read on. I began recording the disappearances. For ships in the past year. For crews lost to the fog. All reports said they saw the golden glow before vanishing into the dark. Some of the villagers believe it's a curse, that the fog is alive, a thing with teeth, and it is always hungry. Caleb's hands trembled as he flicked the page. March 2nd, 1823. I hear the whispers at night. When I stand by the lantern, alone, the whispers come. Sometimes it feels like they're calling me. I fight it, but the pull is strong. I fear I may lose myself if this continues. Caleb put the journal down. His breath felt shallow. His mind buzzed. The golden glow, the fog, disappearances. The keeper had been right. This was no myth. This was a hunger, an entity, and it had been here for centuries. He skimmed further through the journal. Another entry leapt out. June 18th, 1824. I can no longer stand the pull. The golden light calls me from the mist at all hours. Even when I sleep, the fog feels alive. My lantern feels insufficient. I fear what will happen if I lose my grasp on my mind. Caleb's throat tightened as he closed the journal. His hands were cold, his breath quick. The fog didn't just watch. It hunted. It fed on stories, on sailors, on fear. He glanced at the woman beside him, her expression unreadable as she waited. He had no choice. I need more, he said. His voice came out hoarse. The woman raised her eyebrows. More. Anything, he said. His voice was sharp now, desperate. The shipwrecks, the lighthouse records, the histories, everything about the fog. I need to know how it works, how it survives. She paused, considering. Finally, she nodded. I can give you the path, she said. But you must tread carefully, Caleb. You're already listening too closely. He looked at her, fear and hope battling in his chest. How? She stepped back toward the shelves, pulling out a series of old documents and faded maps. Her voice dropped to a whisper. There are records in the older logs, things buried. The truth is in the tides and the stars. Follow the records, trace the names, the disappearances. The fog keeps its secrets close, but they can be found. Caleb felt his chest tighten again as he gathered the papers. He could feel them in his hands, old accounts, secrets, letters. His fingers brushed against the parchment, and the whispers tugged at the edges of his mind. The hunt was beginning, but this time it wasn't just about answers. It was survival. Caleb sat alone in his room that evening, his table littered with papers, journals, and maps. The sun had long since disappeared, and the mist returned, dancing lazily over the distant horizon. His hands trembled as he leafed through the old documents the woman at the archives had given him. He could feel the pull again. The golden glow lingered at the back of his mind, soft whispers clawing at him, threading through his thoughts. His breaths came uneven, and his fingers itched as if they could reach into the fog itself and grasp the answers there. The journal he had found was cold in his hand, its old ink faded but sharp enough to pierce through his thoughts. The pieces were coming together, but they didn't make sense. The fog hung in waves, a thing alive. The golden glow called to them. Disappearance, whisper, hunger. He closed the journal and set it down, staring at the scattered documents and maps on his table. His eyes landed on one particular map, the edges torn and stained. It showed Glome Shore and the surrounding areas. His breath quickened as he traced a series of routes leading to the lighthouse. The map indicated strange patterns, sail routes that led into fog, areas where ships had disappeared without a trace. A series of red X's dotted along these paths. His pulse quickened as he matched their positions to dates from the records. They were patterns. The fog had a rhythm, a cycle. Caleb's chest ached as he pieced it together. He needed to go to the lighthouse itself. Investigating the old lighthouse. The next morning, the mist clung to the cliffs like an old memory. Caleb wrapped his coat tightly around him and set off toward the old lighthouse with his pack of papers and maps. His body felt heavy as he climbed the steep path again, but this time the pull felt stronger. The whispers in his mind felt closer. The old lighthouse loomed in the distance, its stone walls rough and cold against the wind. The sound of waves crashing against the cliffs roared beneath him. His legs ached as he approached the old, iron-wrought door, its paint flaking and rusted with age. He hesitated, his hand gripping the iron handle. Something felt wrong. The door groaned as he pushed it open, and he stepped into the cold, damp interior of the lighthouse. The air was colder here, the scent of salt water sharp in his nostrils. The sound of the wind whistling through cracks in the stone made it feel as though the walls were alive. Inside, the lighthouse was dark and quiet. His breath hitched as he walked into the spiral staircase. The iron steps creaked under his boots. His hand rested on the cool stone walls as he began to climb. He had to reach the Lightkeeper's chambers. There had to be answers in the old records stored there. His steps felt uneven as he climbed. His heart ached as he imagined what he would find. The spiral staircase opened onto the observation deck, the vast sea stretching out beneath a gray sky. It was beautiful but cold, its expanse disorienting. Caleb leaned on the railing, breathing hard. The whispers came again. They were faint, but they were there. He felt his heart tighten. Before he could overthink it, he made his way down toward the living quarters. The keeper's study, dusty and old, awaited him. The keeper's forgotten log. The keeper's study was a narrow, dark space filled with old logs, dust-covered furniture, and cobwebs. Caleb felt the pull again as he rifled through the journals on the wooden desk. His fingers brushed the weathered pages of a well-kept log. He pulled it toward him. The log was different from the journal he had found earlier. This one was handwritten, but it had notes and names. His eyes scanned the entries. One name stood out, Leora Ashmore. The name sent a shiver through his chest. He looked at the date beside it, January 6, 1821. The words were buried beneath layers of weathered ink. Leora Ashmore, first vessel lost to the golden glow, trapped in the fog. No survivors. Caleb's heart pounded. He scanned the log further. More names followed the same pattern. Each name, a ship, a crew, a disappearance. His hands shook as he connected the dots. Each loss, each name had a golden thread of fate attached to the glow and the fog. They weren't random. They were deliberate. Every ship that ventured too far into the mist, every name here had vanished into the pool. Caleb felt a sickness in his gut. He looked back at the journal again. These names, the dates, they weren't isolated. The fog was hungry, but it also seemed planned. There was rhythm here, patterns, and then another note caught his eye. Leora Ashmore's disappearance reported during the turning tides. Fog followed the vessel. Whispering came from below. He froze. He knew the whispers. He knew the golden glow. And now he could hear it again. The fog was alive. It had found him. The cold air of the lighthouse stung Caleb's skin as he sat hunched over the logbook, the names of the lost crew haunting his thoughts. He could hear the wind howling through the cracks in the lighthouse walls. But there was something else now, something deeper, as if the building itself was holding its breath. His mind raced. The logbook was clear, the fog wasn't random. It had a purpose. The names, the dates, the whispers that had begun to fill his own thoughts. It was all connected, and it had been happening for far too long. He couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. The whispers, the draw of the golden glow, it wasn't something to escape. It was something he needed to confront. As Caleb stood to leave the study, a soft creak echoed through the floorboards. He froze. The door, which had been firmly closed moments before, now hung slightly ajar. It wasn't the wind. Caleb could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Something was wrong. His pulse quickened, and his breath became shallow. He took a slow step forward, his hand grazing the wall, which seemed unnaturally cold. The air thickened, and his mind raced with possibilities. Had someone entered the lighthouse, or was this the fog itself, seeping inside, coming for him? Caleb stepped toward the door. his heart pounding against his ribs. His hand reached out for the handle, but before he could touch it, he heard it again, the faintest whisper. "Come closer." The voice wasn't from outside. It came from somewhere within the lighthouse itself. It was subtle, insistent, almost loving in its desperation. Caleb's hand faltered midair. His thoughts spun in chaotic circles. His feet shuffled forward, his mind torn between fear and the need to know. The passage beckoned. He couldn't ignore it. With trembling hands, Caleb pushed the door fully open. The secret below. The room was unlike anything he'd seen in the lighthouse. Hidden behind a thick curtain of dust and shadow was a narrow stairway, one that seemed to descend into nothing. The darkness at the bottom of the stairs was absolute, a cold, stifling blackness that seemed to pull at him with every passing second. The air here was thick with mildew and decay, and the heavy scent of salt lingered like the trace of a long-forgotten secret. Caleb's heart beat faster as he gazed down the stairs, a shiver crawling up his spine. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, swirling in the dark like 1,000 lost voices. He stepped forward, each footfall a resounding echo in the silence. The wooden steps groaned beneath his weight, and with each creak, he felt his stomach twist tighter. The further he descended, the colder it became, until the chill bit through his clothing, leaving him feeling raw and exposed. At the bottom of the stairs, Caleb's eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness. His breath caught in his throat. Before him was a large chamber, its walls covered in old, tattered maps and faded sketches of ships, waves, and what looked like strange, swirling symbols. But what truly caught his attention was the center of the room, an altar of sorts. It was made of smooth stone, weathered by time, with intricate carvings that almost seemed to move when he focused on them too long. The altar had a deep crack running down the middle, as if it had been split open by something ancient and powerful. And in front of it, laying on the floor, was a weathered chest. Caleb's hand reached out instinctively. The chest felt heavier than he expected, as if it carried the weight of centuries. He lifted it carefully, feeling the cold wood beneath his fingers, and placed it on the altar. As he opened it, a thick, pungent fog seemed to rise from the chest. Caleb stepped back, his throat tightening, but he couldn't stop himself from looking inside. The fog parted just enough for him to glimpse the contents. An old yellowed scroll, tied with a piece of thread. Something about it felt wrong. His heart raced, the whispers in the chamber growing louder now, louder than ever before. As his fingers closed around the scroll, a sudden chill shot through his bones. "It's here." The whisper came again, louder than the others, almost like a growl now. "It's waiting for you." The revelation. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. The scroll was cold in his hands, as though it had been waiting for him all along. He hesitated for a moment before slowly unrolling it. The parchment was fragile, its edges curling with age. It was covered in strange markings, symbols that seemed almost alien, yet familiar. He could feel them tugging at his mind as if they had been there all along, waiting for him to decipher them. And then he saw it. A map. Not a map of Glomshore, but something much older. The symbols and markings indicated points, dark, ominous spots. And at the center of them all was the lighthouse, the golden glow, the fog, and the whispers. The map wasn't just showing the locations of shipwrecks. It was showing where the fog had fed. Caleb's heart pounded as he continued to study the map, tracing the lines with his fingers. Each marked location on the map corresponded to a different time, a different name. It was the history of the fog, but it wasn't just history. It was alive. The fog had been following the same cycle for centuries, drawing in ships, drawing in souls. It was using them, feeding on them to grow stronger. But there was something more. In the center of the map was a symbol, an intricate spiral, and written beside it were 3 words: the turning tide. Caleb's pulse quickened. He had heard that phrase before, the turning tide. It was the name of the last ship that had disappeared, its crew lost forever to the fog. He had thought it was just another name, another tragedy. But now he knew the truth. The fog wasn't just a storm. It was a force, a hungry entity that had been feeding for centuries. And Caleb unknowingly had become part of its story. As the last of the fog lifted from the chest, Caleb looked around the chamber. The walls seemed to pulse, the carvings on them shifting as though they were alive. The whispering voices had grown into a cacophony, their volume deafening. Caleb was trapped. The air in the secret chamber felt alive. Caleb could sense it, tangible and cold, wrapped around him like a fog made of whispers and secrets. His heart was beating too fast, his breaths too shallow, as if the very walls of the ancient space were alive and could hear his fear. The scroll was still clutched in his hand, its symbols and the ominous map spread out before him. His fingers trembled as he stared at the phrase, the turning tide. It lingered in his mind, a soundless mantra. The golden glow, the fog, the whispers, they weren't random. They all connected to the turning tide. His body ached with exhaustion and dread as the memories swam through his mind. He had assumed the fog was merely an ancient, eerie phenomenon. Now he understood its hunger. It feeds on the tides, on boats lost, on fear and memories. His hand clutched the map again, his eyes tracing the spiraling markings, their movements unsettling in their irregularity. There was a path here, ancient and deliberate, a rhythm to the golden glow. The fog wasn't random. It had its own methods, its own plan, and Caleb had stepped into its web. The question was, how could he escape? He looked around the chamber again. The fog from the chest still lingered faintly, twisting like ghostly fingers. The carvings on the walls pulsed. He could hear the sound of the waves outside, distant but rhythmic, like the beat of a song that matched the whispers. Caleb felt the pull. He knew he had to go back to the surface, but the whispers now had grown stronger. His muscles tensed, his breaths quickened. He could hear words, faint but distinct, now in clear, sharp tones. "You can't escape now." Caleb's breath hitched. He took a step back, clutching the map tighter, and suddenly the whisper became a roar in his head. His vision blurred. His knees felt weak. He stumbled toward the staircase, gripping the cold stone as he fought against the pull. The spiral stairs felt endless as he climbed. His legs burned. His hands scraped against the stone, but he didn't stop. His breaths came harder as though the fog was trying to pull him back into its grip. His thoughts were a whirl of terror and logic, but the terror was winning. The fog wasn't letting him leave. It wanted something, the escape, He reached the surface, his body heaving with exhaustion, his lungs gasping for air. His hands gripped the cold, iron railing as he stared out at the gray, misty horizon. His eyes darted toward the sea, but all he could see was fog. His legs felt weak, his breath unsteady. The whispers had stopped. His hands shook as he closed his eyes. Was it real? His mind was uncertain, fear clouding his thoughts. But no, the scroll was real. The journal was real. The fog was real. Caleb looked at the sky, the horizon now swallowed by layers of mist. His heart ached. The phrase, "the turning tide," lingered in his mind. He needed to return to the village. He needed to figure out how to stop this. But how? He knew this was far from over. The fog was ancient, its hunger vast, its pull inevitable. The golden glow wouldn't stop until it had him or until the tide stopped turning. He had stumbled into its story, and now he had to find a way out. Caleb began his descent down the cliffs, his breath shaky, his body aching. His thoughts kept returning to the turning tide. A name, a ship, curse. He needed to find out what it meant, how it connected to the golden glow and the fog, how he could sever its hold. The winds tugged at his coat as he made his way back to Seafarer's Rest. The fog clung to him, and he could feel its weight, its fingers at the edge of his thoughts. He had come face to face with the ancient truth, but he wasn't sure he could escape the tide. Caleb awoke the next morning with the taste of salt lingering in his throat and his bones aching from his escape. The village of Seafarer's Rest was quiet, the mist still clinging to the horizon like ghostly memories. His bed felt damp, his body exhausted, but he knew sleep would not come. His mind was a whirlwind of symbols, maps, fog, and whispers. The turning tide, the ancient fog, the golden glow, they had all come too close. Now the question loomed, how could he stop this? Caleb knew he had to return to the archives. There were clues there, hidden answers buried in texts and history, symbols that connected these pieces. And so, with grim determination, he set out to gather his thoughts and organize his findings. The village was silent when he stepped out, the air sharp with mist and wind. His steps were deliberate as he made his way to the local archives, a modest, weathered building tucked beside the old church at the center of the village. The journey back to the archives. The archives were a narrow, dimly lit room filled with wooden shelves. Ancient tomes, journals, and scrolls sat stacked in precarious towers. The scent of aged paper and old wood was in the air, mingling with the faint sound of distant gulls and the rolling waves of the sea. Caleb could feel the pull as he stepped inside. His hand rested on the edge of a dusty shelf. He could almost hear the whispers again, faint and far off, like a memory in the wind. He took a deep breath and scanned the collection. His eyes fell on a weathered journal sitting on a high shelf. The cover was leather-bound and cracked, but the faintest golden pattern gleamed under the dust. His hand hovered for a moment before pulling it down. His heart pounded as he set it on the table. This was the key. He flipped it open, and the familiar symbols stared back at him. His hands shook as he read the first passages. Words about tides, golden glows, rituals, and disappearing ships leapt off the pages. The symbols and dates connected seamlessly to the fog and the turning tide. The journal spoke of a ritual, an ancient, forbidden rite meant to sever the pull of the fog, a way to stop the golden glow, to sever the whispers, to break the curse that had clung to the tides for centuries. His eyes darted over the descriptions. It was a sacrifice, but not in the way one might expect. The text described ancient traditions, symbols, and patterns. The rituals required specific timing, during the turning of the tide, at the exact moment when the golden glow had its strongest pull. This was the window of opportunity to sever its hold, to burn away its hunger with ancient words and ancient fire. Caleb's hand clenched the journal tighter. His heart ached with desperation and fear. It sounded impossible, but this was his only hope. The fog would never let him go unless he tried to stop it. He could feel time slipping away. The whispers were stronger now. His mind was fogged, and yet he had a choice. He could give in to fear or he could prepare. The ritual would involve finding the symbols and setting them in the sea at the right time. He would need fire, the correct words, and courage. His fingers traced the symbols on the page as they leapt from the journal. They were similar to the symbols he'd seen in the hidden chamber beneath the lighthouse. His path was clear. He would confront the fog. He would face the ritual. But the question remained, would he survive? Gathering the tools, Caleb spent the next few days gathering supplies. His mind was a constant churn of research and planning. His hands were calloused as he sifted through old tomes, piecing together every fragment of the ritual. The fog lingered, cold and ever-present, but it did not make itself known yet. Perhaps it was waiting, perhaps it was patient. Either way, Caleb needed to be ready. He visited old ships, abandoned docks, and spoke with the village elders, who looked at him with confusion and fear. They had heard whispers of the golden glow and the fog before, but no one knew how deep it ran. Most would not believe him, but Caleb didn't care. His research and preparations were his own. He gathered items from local stores: firewood, sea salt, ancient parchment, candles, and oil. The journal gave him instructions for symbolic gestures. He would have to burn the symbols at the turning tide, during the exact moment when the golden glow would attempt to rise again. The nights felt colder as he worked. The mists had become his constant companions, their whispers faint but alive. They crept into his dreams and clung to his skin, leaving him restless. Preparing the ritual. The night before the ritual, Caleb stood at the edge of the cliffs, staring at the horizon. The golden glow was faint now, but he knew it would return. His fingers traced the symbols on the parchment, trying to memorize them, to understand their power. His breaths came slow. The wind tugged at his coat, and the mist swirled beneath it. He could almost feel the fog watching him. "You can't stop us." The voice came again. The fog was alive. His hands trembled as he held the parchment tighter. "Yes, I can," he whispered back. The ritual would take everything from him. His strength, his courage, his mind. He would face the fog on its terms. But this was his only choice. He returned to the study one last time and placed the symbols on the parchment, their outlines clear in the dim glow of a single candle. His hands were steady despite the fear, despite the pull of whispers and golden fog. He would leave at the turning tide. The night felt heavy, the sea loud in the distance. Caleb could hear the sound of waves rolling in as if they were alive. He knew he wouldn't return from this, but he had to try. Caleb could not shake the feeling that his victory had come at a price. His body ached, and his mind buzzed with fragments of symbols and ancient chants. The retreat of the fog felt both triumphant and ominous. It was as if the sea itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The whispers lingered, fading in and out, no longer sharp and demanding, but constant. A low, steady hum in the back of his mind. He returned to the archives, as much to sort through his thoughts as to analyze his research. The ancient journal lay open on the table, its leather cover worn and ink smudged from years of neglect. Caleb tried to focus on the symbols, on their meaning, their history, but the words felt hollow, distant. His hands shook slightly as he traced their shapes with his finger. The symbols were ancient. His heart felt uneasy as he pieced together the connections. They tied into the rituals, into the fog, into the turning tide. But there was more here, something deeper. The journal hinted at layers of history, warnings about the fog, about its nature, about its return. And then he found it. Buried at the back of a page was a sentence, barely legible, scrawled in tight handwriting. The fog never dies. It waits. Caleb froze. His breath came fast as the words sank in. He stared at them, his pulse quickening. The fog waited. That was it. The golden glow, the rituals, the symbols, they would hold it back for a time, but it would return. It always would. His stomach sank. If he were to survive, he would need to uncover the entire truth. Caleb resolved to spend the next few days searching for more clues, pushing through the ancient texts and the symbols scattered in the journal. But even as he traced their patterns, he could feel the pull in his bones again. The whispers came back stronger at night, always distant but persistent. He needed guidance. Caleb decided that the village elders would know something. Perhaps they could give him the insight he desperately needed. The fog had haunted this place for generations, and its secrets were buried in old tales, old warnings. So he sought out the elders in their modest homes and gatherings, careful not to let his questions sound desperate or frantic. The first elder he spoke to was Ewan, an old man with wrinkled skin and piercing blue eyes. His voice was soft, but firm, and carried a weight that made Caleb uneasy. Ewan listened carefully as Caleb explained his experience, the fog, the ritual, and the symbols. His words came carefully, like fragile threads through the air. The fog is always a part of this place, Ewan said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of years. We've fought it before, long ago, in ways that no longer make sense to us. It is a part of the sea, and the sea never forgets. Caleb frowned. You fought it? How? Ewan hesitated, his hand resting on the wooden armrest of his chair. His eyes were distant as he considered the question. With fire, with symbols, with ancient prayers. But the fog is clever. It always returns. Caleb swallowed hard. But it can be stopped? The elder looked at him, and Caleb could feel a moment of hesitation in the air. You can't destroy it, Ewan said finally. You can only hold it back. It will wait, always wait, until the tides change. Caleb felt his shoulders sink. His hope was fading as he listened to the old man's words. Why? What is it? Why does it come? What is its hunger? Ewan closed his eyes, as if considering whether to share ancient truths. The fog is ancient, older than any of us. It is not a monster or a creature as we might think. It is a part of the tides, a reflection of greed, human history, and sacrifice. The golden glow is its signal, the promise that it can consume. We appease it with rituals and prayers, but even those only stave off its hunger. Caleb let out a sharp breath. Then I haven't destroyed it. You've delayed it, Ewan said. His gaze was steady. But you will need more than symbols and rituals to truly break free of it. The fog will not forgive. Caleb shivered as he stood. And how do I stop it? Ewan looked at him, shaking his head slightly. The fog has its secrets. You must uncover them. Some truths are buried in ancient ruins, in forgotten libraries, in the places where the tide meets the earth. Caleb thanked the elder, though his heart felt heavier than before. As he walked back toward his modest home, the conversation lingered in his mind. The fog was not merely a threat, but a part of the very nature of the sea itself. Its hunger would not be silenced easily, nor would its whispers ever stop. But perhaps there was a path. Perhaps the ruins held answers. You would find them. Caleb knew the next step would involve uncovering the ancient ruins. Ewan's words lingered with him. The fog has its secrets. The ruins, buried under centuries of tide and time, might hold the answers he needed to understand the fog and its endless hunger. His journey was no longer about survival alone. It was about knowledge, discovery, and finding a way to stop this cycle once and for all. He spent days preparing. He gathered supplies, maps, and tools. His journey would take him along the old pathways, the ancient markers, and into the heart of forgotten territory. The whispers never left him, and the fog lingered on the horizon, its glow faint but alive. The journey was cold. His feet sank into wet sand as he followed ancient trails and forgotten markers. His breaths came shallow as he moved, his eyes scanning for symbols, for signs, for anything that would point him toward the ancient ruins. The winds tugged at him, and the sea groaned under the weight of its own waves. The fog seemed to watch him as he walked, following him, waiting for him to falter. He found himself at the foot of stone ruins partially buried in sand. Ancient stones rose in uneven formations, weathered by time and tide. His fingers touched their surfaces, cold and smooth, the symbols worn but still clear under his hand. His breath came in short bursts as he stepped into the ancient structures. The wind howled between the stones, and the whispers rose louder. They were stronger here. Caleb pressed on, feeling the pull. The ruins felt alive, the earth humming with power. These stones were ancient witnesses older than memory. They would have the answers he sought, and yet they would demand something from him in return. The fog had waited for centuries. It would wait a little longer. Caleb would uncover its secrets. Caleb moved deeper into the ancient ruins, his heart pounding as though it, too, were alive. The wind tugged at his coat, and the whispers had grown louder now, a chorus of low murmurs, indistinct and disjointed. His breath came in shallow bursts as his fingers traced the weathered stone, feeling the grooves of ancient symbols. They were familiar, but they felt different now, alive, pulsing, as though they recognized him. The air grew colder with every step. The ruins stretched further than he had expected, fragments of ancient buildings and arches forming a labyrinth of old rock and earth. He could hear the sound of the waves crashing in the distance, but here, Amidst the ancient stones, it felt different. It felt as though the whispers had teeth, scraping at the edges of his mind. His hands trembled as he pulled his journal from his pack and studied the symbols once more. They matched. Each pattern he uncovered here tied back to the symbols in the journal, the ones from his rituals. But something was different about these symbols. They pulsed with an energy Caleb couldn't decipher. The air grew heavier as he moved through the ruins. His breath felt labored, as though the fog itself were pressing down on him, and his fingers clung to the ancient stones. He reached what looked like a central altar, a flat, circular platform of ancient stone, partially buried in sand. Its surface was covered with symbols, more intricate than the others he had seen. Caleb knelt beside it, his fingers trembling as they traced the carvings. His heart felt strange here, beating erratically, as though the symbols were alive under his touch. His head swam. "What is this place?" he whispered to himself. The wind howled through the ruins, carrying with it a strange noise, a low, almost imperceptible rumble. His breath hitched as he forced himself to steady his hands. His voice trembled as he spoke the first word, "Ancient and ancient alone." What are you?" The air shifted. Caleb froze. The whispers rose louder, as if the ruins themselves were speaking back to him. His voice felt weak against them, his words nothing more than a faint thread in the wind. His skin prickled as though unseen hands were brushing against him. He closed his eyes, willing himself to calm. The stone beneath his hand felt cold, smooth, ancient. And then he heard it again. A voice. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it came from beneath the stone. His fingers gripped the altar harder. His breathing was erratic now. "I can feel you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "What are you?" The stone seemed to respond, the ancient symbols seeming to shift beneath his hand. His body tensed. The air grew colder still. His vision swam, and in that moment he swore that he could hear a voice, one word in ancient syllables. "Wait," came and went like the wind, soft but sharp. Caleb's heart felt like it had stopped. He stared at the ancient altar, trying to decipher what he had just heard. His mind felt like it was splintering, the whispers invading every thought, every bone in his body. "Wait," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What does that mean?" The wind tugged harder at him. His body felt weak, his legs trembling as though he might collapse. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath. The whispers came again, louder this time. He could almost make out the words, fragments of ancient voices, syllables of truths buried in stone and time. His mind was a whirlwind, every word scraping at his sanity, every syllable a thread pulling him deeper. Caleb realized he needed more than symbols, more than knowledge from the journal or ruins. He needed answers, and answers would demand further exploration. He looked down at the ancient altar, the cold stone beneath his hand. His fingers twitched, the whisper pulling him in. But toward what? He drew in a shaky breath and stood. There was no choice. He would uncover the secrets here, one step at a time. Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that the stone altar had awakened something. His hands trembled as he stepped back from it, his mind racing with ancient symbols and the word he'd felt. Wait, what did it mean? His breath came shallow as he scanned the ruins once again. The fog seemed closer now, its faint glow pulsing in the distance. Caleb knew that time was against him. He couldn't stay here forever, unable to decipher its secrets. His voice trembled as he spoke aloud, more to himself than the wind. "Wait for what?" he asked the ruins. His voice sounded weak and small, but there was no response, just the wind howling through stone and sand. Caleb gathered his things quickly, unwilling to stay near the altar any longer. He had learned that the ruins, ancient as they were, could contain secrets but not answers unless he could decode them properly. His hand clutched his journal tighter as he began his walk back toward Seafarer's Rest. The path back felt heavier. His mind was swamped with symbols and half-heard whispers, the wind tugging at him as if it were pulling him toward the fog. His steps felt weak and uncertain. The sea was cold here, waves lapping at the shore with a steady rhythm, each one seeming to mock him as he struggled to make sense of it all. He would return to the archives. There, perhaps, he could find more answers. The journal felt as though it held fragments of ancient truths, yet the symbols remained cruelly vague. Caleb could feel his sanity slipping as he traced their forms over and over. What was he even hoping to find? The sound of the waves pressing into his thoughts grew louder, and the whispers, faint as they were, returned. It was as if the fog were speaking to him, promising him visions if he would listen. But Caleb refused. Caleb's days in Seafarer's Rest became a blur of ink and parchment. He spent hours at the archives, poring over ancient texts, old journals, and forgotten records. The village's history stretched back centuries, and the fog had always been a part of its story. The journal laid across his table like an unyielding puzzle, its symbols familiar yet cryptic. The fog was a reflection of tides, history, greed, and rituals long abandoned. Caleb could feel this truth like a weight. He knew it had to connect back to the golden glow and the rituals, the waiting. His head swam with possibility. He compared pages, cross-referenced records, and found himself tracing the same symbols again and again. His hands ached from scribbling notes, but nothing connected fully. His nights were spent unable to sleep, tossing and turning as the whispers rose louder in his dreams. He had one lead, an ancient text referencing the origins of rituals tied to the tides. A group called the Tidebound Elders had performed ceremonies meant to hold back the fog for centuries, and their methods involved chants and sacrifices. The sacrifices were said to appease the fog, to push its hunger into the depths of the sea. Caleb wasn't certain he could do that, but he had no choice. He needed more context. He needed to understand how the fog was fed, how its hunger was tied to human patterns and behaviors. He traced the symbols again. The whispers felt stronger. Caleb could not ignore his dreams. They came to him each night, sharp, fragmented, and alive with symbols and golden light. He would lie in his bed, restless, eyes half open, and feel his mind slip into another plane. A cold, wet darkness would come for him, fog-like tendrils reaching out, pulling at his limbs. He would hear ancient voices. Sometimes they were calm, soothing, and other times they were angry, demanding. One phrase repeated itself as if mocking him. "It waits." He would wake in the dead of night, his body damp with sweat, his breathing fast and shallow. His heart would race, and the whisper would linger in his chest. His mind would replay the symbols, the golden glow, the whispers at the altar. The fog had been alive in his dreams, its hunger a constant, pulling force. Caleb knew these were not merely dreams but memories, echoes of truths buried too deeply in time. His mind felt unsteady. He couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching him, that the fog wasn't just distant waves and whispers but something conscious, something ancient. One night, as his breathing came fast and his vision swam under the lamplight, he decided to attempt something. Perhaps the symbols could unlock a path. Perhaps if he could decode their meaning, they would show him a path beyond the fog's grip. He lit a candle, dim and golden, and placed it in the center of his desk. His hands were steady despite his exhaustion as he drew the symbols on parchment. The faint glow of the fire illuminated his movements, and he could feel the pull of them, almost as though they were alive. He closed his eyes, and he felt it. The whispers, they were louder this time, closer. His fingers twitched as if tracing their patterns had summoned something. His breath hitched. The fog wasn't far, not far at all. Caleb awoke the next morning to find himself with fresh notes, the symbols almost dancing in his mind. His body felt as though it belonged to the fog now, alive with whispers and symbols. His journal, with its damp pages, lay beside him. He wasn't certain whether this was a path to salvation or ruin. He decided he needed to test the ritual. He would return to the ruins, this time with the symbols drawn, the chants in his voice, the words spoken under his breath. He gathered supplies and prepared himself. His hands felt uncertain but resolute as he made his way back toward the ruins, the whispers in his mind louder than ever before. The ruins, cold and stone-bound, awaited him. He would attempt the ritual there. Perhaps it would silence the fog, or perhaps it would pull it closer. But he felt compelled to try. The wind tugged at his coat, and the altar glowed faintly under his touch as he began the chant. His voice rose, the symbols embedded in his mind. The fog came closer, its golden glow alive. Something shifted. The ground trembled, and the whispers rose louder. The ground beneath Caleb's feet shifted as he finished the chant. His voice trembled, the syllables foreign and strange as they danced on his tongue. The wind roared louder, and the golden fog rose, tendrils twisting like living hands. His throat felt dry, his breath shallow, but he couldn't stop now. The symbols on the altar glowed faintly. Caleb stepped back, his heart pounding. The fog seemed to breathe, expanding toward him, curling and shifting like the exhale of some ancient beast. His hands gripped his journal, his voice growing louder with each phrase. The air crackled with an unseen energy. A low rumble echoed from beneath the stone, and Caleb felt the earth shift once more. His vision blurred as the fog seemed to come alive, glowing brighter, pulsating in waves. His mind screamed at him to stop, but his body would not obey. The whispers were louder now, sharp, clear, demanding. Wait, Caleb's breath came in short, shallow bursts. The altar's symbols pulsed rhythmically, as though alive, responding to his voice, to his ritual. His skin prickled, his fingers felt weak, the words slipping from his lips. The fog moved toward him like a living thing, alive and hungry. He tried to resist, but the force was too great. And then it spoke. The The voice came from the fog itself, low and guttural, just at the edges of comprehension. Caleb could feel it pressing into his mind. "You call," Caleb gasped, stumbling backward. His hands trembled. I need to know," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Who are you? What do you want?" The fog swirled, tendrils reaching out as if mocking his words. The golden glow danced brighter. "We are watchers," the voice said. "We have always waited." The fog rose higher, the whispers now a symphony of sound. Caleb could feel them crawling into his mind. His knees felt weak, and his voice cracked as he forced himself to speak. "Wait for what? What do you mean by wait?" The ground beneath his feet groaned. The fog pulsed. "Everything comes in time." Caleb froze. The words lingered, ethereal and haunting. His heart felt as though it might burst, his body trembling as the fog moved closer. His voice felt like ash in his throat, but he forced himself to speak again. "I need answers," he whispered. "Please." The fog seemed to pause, its glow steadying. "What is your price?" it whispered. Caleb's breath caught. He didn't know the answer to that, but he could feel the fog watching. Caleb stood in the misty fog, the whispers pressing into his mind, pulling at his thoughts. His body felt as though it would give out at any moment. His fingers gripped his journal harder. His voice trembled as the golden light swam before him. "What is your price?" he repeated, his voice shaking. The fog moved, curling closer, tendrils brushing the ground like unseen fingers. Felt like time had stopped. Caleb's breath came fast as though the wind itself were choking him, his thoughts dark with fear. The fog's voice came again, smooth, calm, yet ancient. "To know, you must give. All things have a price." Caleb swallowed hard. His thoughts raced, visions of his life, his sacrifices, his fears flashing through his mind. He didn't understand what the fog meant, but he knew it would demand something he could not prepare for. "What kind of price?" he whispered, bracing himself for an answer. The golden light flickered. "A gift," the fog murmured. "A token to ensure trust." Caleb felt his knees give out. His mind felt as though it were cracking under pressure. A gift. What kind of gift would it demand? His journal? His memories? His sanity? He tried to focus, but his vision swam as though reality itself was slipping. His thoughts felt distant, cold, and uncertain. "I don't know what I can give," he whispered, struggling to stay steady. The fog pulsed again, and Caleb could feel it in his bones, the pressure in the air. He could almost feel the breath of the golden glow on his face. "Think," it said. Caleb closed his eyes, his hands shaking. His entire body trembled as his thoughts consumed him. What could he give? What could satisfy this ancient thing that had been waiting all this time? The answer came to him before he even knew he had thought of it. "I'll offer my trust," he said, his voice fragile but certain. "My understanding." The fog swirled around him again. His chest ached. His heartbeat was steady, but his soul felt frayed. The voice came back, soft and steady. "So be it." Caleb opened his eyes, the fog beginning to settle once more. His body felt light, as though he had just given up a part of himself he could not see. He gasped, his hands gripping his journal tighter. Something had changed. He could feel it. The fog was now watching him, not as a threat, but as an observer. And the whispers had stopped. But Caleb knew this was not over. The price had been paid, and the fog's wait would continue. Caleb returned to his home in Seafarer's Rest. His thoughts felt clouded, his body worn, but something had shifted within him. His understanding was no longer just abstract symbols and whispers. It felt deeper, tied to his bones, tied to the essence of the fog itself. He could hear the whispers still, faint and distant, but they no longer felt like threats. They were echoes now, half-seen truths buried in the fog, waiting for his understanding. His journal felt different in his hands, almost alive, as though it were pulsing with a life of its own. He understood that the fog was more than just a phenomenon. It was ancient, alive, sentient in ways that humans couldn't comprehend. Its hunger came from time, from history, from secrets long buried and forgotten. The whispers were always there, waiting, watching, part of the tides, part of the earth itself. And Caleb had learned that their promises, their truths, could be both salvation and ruin. He could feel its presence now, even without stepping into the mist. It was always there, in the wind, in the waves, in the sound of the tide. But Caleb was no longer afraid. The fog would always wait, and he would wait with it. They understood each other now.